Commission on the report on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. Today, we're award-winning ISO certified national Indigenous organization with a real focus on workplace inclusion, systems, diagnostics, engagement, and partnership strategies. And we have an expanding research agenda. And just last month, we were pleased to announce our partnership with ICD.D, the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion. And for people that belong to both the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion and to Indigenous Works, we're carving out some new initiatives for those joint members. So today, what we're going to cover is the inclusion imperative. Want to talk about land acknowledgement within the umbrella or the realm of truth and reconciliation. Then we'll go into what is land acknowledgement. Finally, why it's important in terms of the Indigenous context and how to structure your land acknowledgement agreements. So look, you all know the history, the Indigenous 101 history, that it was a history of exclusion, and the vision was this: to kill the Indian and the child. And really, what we're faced with collectively, all of us as leadership circle member partners, is how do we, take these, this could be a community up in the left-hand corner, that could be La Loche, Saskatchewan, or Attawapiskat, very, very dismal socioeconomic conditions. But how do we grow green communities, healthy communities, a healthy workforce, and truly an inclusive Canada? So really, that's the collective challenge that we're facing, and how we go about this is critically important. And that's where reconciliation comes in. And we know that the Truth and Reconciliation Report was released in 2015. It came about through the Indian Residential School Settlement. And there are calls to action, as you know, 94 calls to action, number 57 at the public sector, call to action 92 directed at the private sector in terms of things that they can do. And so doing things like the land acknowledgement is just one of those. And so it's really about the things that you as employers can do. And what we wanted to do today was, rather than just, land acknowledgements are more than just the words. There's a deeper perspective and understanding, and we're going to go into that today. I think one of the things I want to share with you is the words of Senator Murray Sinclair, because sometimes people say, can't you just sort of forget about all this and listen to this video clip from Senator Murray Sinclair.
Many people have said over the years that I've been involved in the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, why can't you just get over it and move on? And my answer has always been, why can't you always remember this? Because this is about memorializing those people who have been victims of a great wrong. Why don't you tell the United States to get over 9/11? Why don't you tell this country to get over all of the veterans who died in the Second World War instead of honoring them once a year? Why don't you tell your families to stop thinking about all of your ancestors who died? Why don't you turn down and burn down all of those headstones that you put up for all of your friends and relatives over the years? It's because it's important for us to remember. We learn from it. And until people show that they have learned from this, we will never forget. And we should never forget, even once they have learned from it, because this is a part of who we are. It's not just a part of who we are as survivors and children of survivors and relatives of survivors, but it's part of who we are as a nation. And this nation must never forget what it once did to its most vulnerable people.
Powerful words from, good volume, thumbs up, Craig. Folks, as you sort of hear Senator Murray Sinclair with his powerful words and messages, that I think there are some companies are looking at what can we do in terms of reconciliation. And I think people are looking for sort of these complex strategies, and yet there are many simple, direct things that you can do in terms of educating your employees. And land acknowledgement is just one of these. And so I'm going to turn to Craig Hall, and let's get into now land acknowledgements, what they are and how to construct them. Craig, over to you, please.
Thank you, Kelly. Yes, so I'm speaking to you firstly from Mi'kma'ki, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. It's on Atlantic Canada. So just as a kind of segue, I'll note that, of course, at the end of this month, we have a new holiday dedicated to remembrance. And I hope that some of you will have that day off and some will not, but it will be important, I hope, for you to do things like look at the Truth and Reconciliation document and other kinds of ways of acknowledging your remembrance of these difficult times that Indigenous people have been through in the last century and a half with exclusion and many other travails. So land acknowledgement is also a way of remembering, and it's becoming increasingly popular and has done so since the Truth and Reconciliation report was released back in 2015. Land acknowledgement is it's a verbal or written statement, and it acknowledges the ancestral and traditional land of Indigenous peoples, and it is a respectful act of reconciliation. And we use it often at meetings or events or forums. It can be done in person or online, either way. So next slide, and in the next few slides, I want to just sort of go into kind of the significance of land for Indigenous people. And it bears a really important part in terms of place, in terms of history, belonging and identity. And, you know, by way of sort of introducing that topic, I'll note that in 2020, King Nate was given was the new name given to Cape Dorset in Baffin Island. So this is part of a toponymy series that it has been started back in the 2000s to rename Indigenous communities. And I think you'll appreciate the importance of renaming communities in Inuktitut names. And with that, recognition of the Inuit perspective on history, on place, on identity and belonging. And, you know, I'm sure you know that Cape Dorset, for that region, was a name given by one of the early explorers back in 1600s. And it was named for one of the benefactors of an expedition, the Earl of Dorset. So this name is essentially rooted in colonial history. And by giving it this newer name of Kingnate, which means where the hills are, I think it's really bringing a lot of Inuit perspective on the history and belonging and identity and so on. So that's an important concept, and it sort of harkens back to why do we acknowledge land and what's behind land in Indigenous cultural terms. In the North, you know, we look at the significance of names, and there's been a long history in the Arctic with the naming of individuals. So going way back in time, Inuit people had their own sort of systems for naming people. And around about 1940s or so, these E numbers were introduced largely to enable the administration, the white administration, to work with Indigenous people up north and allow them the possibility of being administered, if you will. And the numbers here mean something significant. The E, it was either prefixed with an E or a W, meaning East or Western Arctic. 6 is a number of a region. There were 12 regions, and then the last digits had to do with the individuals' registration in a system. So this was met obviously with different levels of favor from Inuit people. They didn't like to wear these tags, and it had a lot of controversy around it. Around about 1970, the commissioner at the time, Stuart Hodgson, came up with this idea of a thing called project surname. And the idea was to give Inuit a first and a last name. And they hired an administrator, his name was Abe Utpik, to run around the north. And he was very a good linguist and really had an understanding of the families in the north. And people chose their names, first and last name. So, you would think that that was it was a good thing in some respects, but I think you'd agree that the Western way of naming people was still rooted in sort of colonialist ways. So there's sort of different perspectives on project surname historically, and just how well it was received. But it certainly was, I'm sure you would agree, a better way than naming people by number. So in the next slide, again, it's this sort of assertion of identity. The name is all important. And when we name people, when we name places, we're really conjuring up a cultural way of looking at the individual or the place with the language. And we're using a very sort of key set of historical constructs when we use these names. And that all starts to come through in this land acknowledgement. So actually many Indigenous community names translate into descriptions of land and rivers and land formations and special landmarks. An example on the next slide is the water of the spirits in the Sioux and the Nakota Stony language for Lake Minnewanka. And that's a very lovely name for this very picturesque area. But over time, often people forget the root of the language and the root of the name. And I think that's very unfortunate, because I think the historical root of the name is really important to keep in the forefront. And when we do land acknowledgements, this is part of what we're doing, is we're keeping in the forefront our desire to remember things about Indigenous culture and Indigenous meaning that are very, very important. On the next slide, we just have a few more examples of places that have Indigenous names. Nunavut, for instance, is actually our land in Inuktitut. And land acknowledgement is actually not used as much up north, simply because Nunavut is already the name for our land. But other names here are given here just to show how the names in Indigenous languages often speak to the characteristics of different things, like a way that a river might flow, or the way that there might be some topography, some significance to that. So it's a very useful thing to look back at these things. What I really like about this particular slide, though, is it starts to get into the whole matter of what is the importance of land to Indigenous people. And we're seeing in each of these quadrants different aspects of why land is important. So you have, physical sort of relationship to land, mental and intellectual relationship. There's a social and emotional relationship, and cultural and spiritual relationship. And this is a very important framing, I believe, in terms of the significance of land to Indigenous people. So on the next slide then, as we look at land acknowledgements, these are the sort of ways to frame how land acknowledgement can be done and how we're trying to capture with some of the words these different relationships that Indigenous people have to land. And I think that this would be really good as you develop your own land acknowledgements to keep this framework in mind. And Kelly was going to give you a few examples of different types of land acknowledgements and how that actually works. So I'll turn it back to you, Kelly. You're on mute there.
Thank you, Craig. Just to finish off on this slide, you can see that the land acknowledgement is much deeper than words, that you, in many cases, you are touching this cultural, the social, emotional, and the mental and the intelligent side of this land connection. And the physical connection is obvious. You're there on the land, on the territories, but you're dealing with people who pray to the land. They've offered tobacco to the land. They see it as a part of this holistic and refer to the land like a brother and a sister. And so it has a very, very deep connection. I think that as you move forward, then let's sort of talk about when and where and sort of the construction of these. Is that we're now seeing land acknowledgements at meetings and gatherings, both online, as Craig said, or in person, events and conferences, reports, your communication activities, your websites, your media events, and again, all in person and online events. So how do you structure your land acknowledgement? First of all, you can put it in the context of the activity or the event that you're running. What is your organization or your company's relationship to the territory? So it might be new, or you might be friends to this territory, and you can sort of situate it that way. You want to gain some insight on the history of the territory. Do some homework. You can Google it. You can go to the communities. They have websites. They have information. And often the academic institutions also have good histories on the territories where you will be meeting or conducting your business or your events. And then the fourth part is determining the territories that you will be acknowledging. Now, this is not too difficult. You can acquire this knowledge. There are different ways, and we're going to show you some of the websites, web tools, as well as community connections that you can make to structure your land acknowledgement. So let's, I think though it's probably a way to fast track this is we're going to show you some examples of land acknowledgements. So here's one on a website. Every time that President Larry Rosea starts a meeting or any of his VPs or managers, they have this communication slide with this land acknowledgement. And Sask Polytechnique is situated on Treaty 4, Treaty 6, and the ancestral lands of the Cree, the Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota peoples, and the traditional homeland of the Métis. So they've created this, and this is the slide that they would use in almost all their presentations. Here's one out of Ontario, which was an education report. And they, again, did this acknowledgement in their report. Here's another example, and this is deeper than just a land acknowledgement. In this case, this professor at the Groton School of Business is acknowledging the territory of the Mississaugas, the Hodneys, and within the lands, but she goes on to talk about the dish with one spoon wampum. So what's interesting about this one is that there's actually a teaching here, and you're learning something about, first of all, there was a treaty or an agreement called the dish with one spoon. It's a peace agreement, and it's a covenant. And you can see the message here. So again, this is a little deeper, a little longer, but has a kind of a neat teaching that sort of goes with this in all of her communication messages. Whoops, I jumped ahead. People are putting them in their signatures, their email signatures. So here, Sean Sunias, he's one of our board members at Indigenous Works. He's the Director of Indigenous Relations at Farm Credit Canada. They work across Canada, but he's located in Regina, Saskatchewan. So his signature line is he's headquartered on the Treaty 4 land and the traditional homeland of the Métis. So other folks in Farm Credit in different areas of the country would have a different email signature line. Now, this is brand new. I want to share with you, this is also being done in Australia. I thought you might find this interesting, is that in Australia, the land acknowledgement is called Welcome to Country. Welcome to Country. So, and they have been doing this much longer than Canadians and in Canada. Craig and I were down in Australia. We first, we heard these welcome to country. Every politician, community groups, it's just part and parcel of how they start. Now, when they refer to country, they're literally referring to the territory. And, here's an acknowledgement from Karen Millward. And this particular welcome to country is at a meeting where there's people from all different locations, so different territories. And she's acknowledging that all the attendees were meeting on Aboriginal countries, plural. And I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin, the Bunji, the creator spirit, and the Wa, the crow, the protector, who together are looking after us. And I pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. So you generally hear Australians talking about, I pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. It is almost part and parcel of every acknowledgement. You all know that I'm going to show you one more from Australia, and it's in an email. And this was a friend of mine in Australia. And interestingly, as the graveside discoveries story broke, she wrote to me and many other Canadian friends and offered her condolences just to say, hey, we're thinking about you in Canada. And I went back and I looked at her email, and you can see in her email signature line, we pay deepest respect to the traditional custodians of the country across Australia. We acknowledge and thank our elders who demonstrated over 60,000 years of sustainable Indigenous business and ask them to guide us back to a more prosperous, I can't see the rest of my words on the screen, Subhash, prosperous, Craig, finish it off.
Prosperous and purposeful future.
Great. So again, I thought it's good for us to see what's happening around the world, and again here in Australia. So here's some protocol tips and resources. What if you're in a meeting and the meeting started and no one has done an land acknowledgement? Should I do one? Yes. Start and say, and just do it like the way Craig and I did. I'm on Treaty 6 in the Métis homeland of Saskatchewan. Can I offer a land acknowledgement if it has already been offered? Yes. So each person can do this. Yours might be shorter and paraphrased based on perhaps a longer land acknowledgement that might be at the beginning of the meeting. So you would say, I also want to acknowledge I'm on such and such a territory. Do Indigenous people acknowledge other Indigenous people's lands? The answer is yes, and they've been doing this for hundreds and thousands of years. You generally find people will say, Indigenous people would say, as they go to other territories, thank you for welcoming me to your territory, to your lands. And so it's the same protocol. It's the same protocol and expectations. What if I can't pronounce the names? Well, good luck. We have the same challenge. So it's about trying it. And today with what I'll tell you, the old trick, what people used to do is they used to, and this, a lot of the resource companies started this, they would phone up the community after hours, so like 8 at night, and they could listen to the receptionist pronounce the name of the community. So that's how they learned. You got to go on mute, folks. Can you go on mute, please? That's how they learned the pronunciation. Now today with Google and Wikipedia and all these great tools, you can actually download these and it'll help you with the pronunciation. But the good thing is just try it. I mean, it's good. It can create some good humor too. And it just shows good effort on everyone's part. I mentioned at the very beginning, there's some resources. So which lands are you on? There are some websites that are now providing a connection. So you literally put your spot on the map and it says you're on the territories of so-and-so. But just a caveat, what we're finding is they're not always super accurate. Some of these are based with US groups and were developed for North America. So just you want to go a step further to verify that your territories are properly acknowledged and identified. So you could work with the Native Friendship Centers in your regions. There are Indigenous Employment and Skills Training Centers. There are educational institutions that you might say, hey, how do you guys acknowledge? When you do your acknowledgement, what do you do? And you can simply copy and extract from them. Talk to community members, phone them up. We have a meeting coming up. We're really looking forward to this. We want to make sure who's the elder, and we want to get the land acknowledgement. Can you help us with the wording, please? And you can learn more here, some other connections and websites. So some resources, you're going to see this PowerPoint deck and you'll be able to access these in due course. So that really, I wanted to, I wanted to give a shout out. I hope that's helpful, and we'll have some question and answer here. But folks, I want you to look ahead to 2022, and we're going to be doing our national event, Inclusion Works 2022 online. It's scheduled for June 15th of 2022 from noon to 3:30. So please mark your calendars now. The theme is going to be innovations in Indigenous inclusion. So wanted to give you folks a heads up, lots of advance notice, and let the members within your own companies and teams know about this important date. So that concludes the land acknowledgement. We hope we've given you a deeper understanding of the importance of the cultural, the spiritual, emotional, and physical importance of land to Indigenous people, and why those words and this action is really an action of reconciliation in the most positive sense. I think reconciliation is not and should not be coming from a place of guilt. It's coming from a place of, if you look it up in Wikipedia, the definition is the rebuilding of friendly relations is the definition of reconciliation. And so what a great way to build friendly relations, incorporating land acknowledgement in your organization's practices going forward. So let's open it up. Hope that was very, very helpful, and we look forward to any questions and comments. I'm going to look at the chat here. Subhash, how are we doing with?
Yeah, so there is one question from Sonia. Ria,
Anya, can you help verify our acknowledgement? So so there's two things we can do here. We're working with the CCDI, the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion. There are fees attached to it, but we can help you design, build, and create your land acknowledgement strategy and protocols. So you can contact us for that. If it's simply a quick review of your strategy, again, contact us. Our members. We do have some non-members on this call. You're certainly welcome to reach out to us as well, and we'll quote you on the fees to do that. So Carla's saying, I acknowledge every Zoom meeting I attend. So great. That's exactly, this was a Zoom meeting. You go to meetings, or this was a Zoom webinar. When you go to meetings, do the acknowledgement. It literally it can take a very short period of time, or it can be longer depending on your company's strategy.
And I think she was partly responding to one of the earlier questions that said, should we do the land acknowledgements for every Zoom meeting that we have throughout the day, or just certain ones? So I think there's no hard and fast on this, but where it's possible, the more the better. But it doesn't have to be with everyone. It just depends on your organization and what protocols you choose to adopt.
I do meetings throughout the day, a number of Zoom meetings, as all you folks, and and Craig does this as well. It's sort of just built into our DNA. We just do it. We just and but the funny part is, I was talking about land acknowledgements in another session, and I forgot to do one. And so again, sometimes you just get started, and people are talking away, and you forget. And again, you can go back and say, hey, I forgot. I want to acknowledge I'm on such and such territory. Again, I think that what'll be very interesting is, 5 to 10 years from now, we'll all look back, and it'll just be part and parcel of the corporate and the organizational and the education culture, right? It'll be like Australia, welcome to country. No one does a training session. They're not doing webinars on how to do it. It's just part and parcel of the norms and the ways and the practices. So we're all on that journey together. I think the more we do it, others are going to obviously copy this practice, and it is opening up the door on reconciliation and building these friendly relations.
And Kelly, there was another question here from Robin Farr, really about the conventions that are emerging around land acknowledgement. So he's saying, what about in a report? Would this need to be on its own page, for instance, and based on whether the organization, where they're headquartered, for instance, or if it's a national company, how would you do that? So I have an answer, but you go ahead first.
No, you start.
Well, I think, again, these conventions are emerging. I think that, if it's an important report, I think it is useful to put the land acknowledgement on a separate page. And I think that aligning it with the headquarters of the organization might be a way to go on that. But again, there's no hard and fast conventions.
So Robin, great to have you. Now, Robin is with Tourism Alberta. So I know she's looking at the Alberta market. So this is a great communications question. So first of all, take a lesson, everybody, include it in reports. That's the most important thing. Number two, where and how. So to Craig's point, you could be bringing this out on its own page. You might actually be articulating your commitment, if you have it, to TRC more broadly. And in terms of where the organization is headquartered, so if the report is for, in this case, Alberta, let's say for a provincial audience of Alberta, you're right. You'd want to be acknowledging that, the land acknowledgement would have to take into account all of Alberta. So that versus Canada as a market, or Western Canada, right? So those are some of the nuances that you're going to have to look at. But it is such a great idea. And look, I would not give its own page, with a nice graphic and so on. But if you're tight on space, I would say make sure you include it, even if it doesn't get its own page. Might be in the preamble, might be on the inside cover, or you saw some examples where it was on the back.
There's another very interesting question from Meg. She says, what specific things could I consider in a land acknowledgement as a white settler? So for example, could I or should I name myself as a settler? That's very interesting. What do you think, Kelly?
I've heard this more and more. I've heard people say, I'm a settler to this land and I'm from so-and-so, or they'll talk about their family roots, where they came from. I've heard this from a lot of Canadian immigrants who talk about, I'm a settler and I came from such and such a place. But here's an interesting one. And I hear this most in British Columbia, mostly, but I'm hearing now, this is in the Indigenous context of a settler. I hear more and more Indigenous people saying, so let's say you're from Saskatchewan. I'm a Cree who's on the lands of the Musqueam and the Tsleil-Waututh, and I'm a guest on their territories. Often Craig, we hear this on our calls with British Columbia, is people talk about, I'm a settler, I'm a guest on the territories of, and they name them. We're starting to hear that some other places. So it's not just sort of settlers, it's anybody native or non-native, or Indigenous or non-Indigenous, working in and around those lands and so on. So yeah, I would say do what's comfortable. If you feel comfortable, then situate yourself as a settler and do the acknowledgement. It'll encourage other settlers to do it.
I had a different take on it, and I'll say it, but it might be a little bit controversial. But I heard a piece on CBC the other day. We're talking about the white settlers acknowledging their identity in terms of being a white settler. And the individual on the radio was saying, well, I'm actually from Ireland. And, you know, there was never people more repressed than by the English than the Irish. And so there are white settlers and there are white settlers. I guess that was sort of the upshot of it. And again, I think it goes back to what you're saying, Kelly, that it's, you know, what's in your identity, what is your, what do you mean by being a white settler, and you know, what do others mean? It's a very interesting question, actually, as you get into it.
Yeah. So here's a question, Rosie asking: within reports, what if you work Canada-wide? What should be the messaging in the report? So it's the same principle here. You're going to need a land acknowledgement that acknowledges the territories. You know, the First Nations, Métis, Inuit people across Canada. So we can help you with that. But again, Canada-wide, you want to make sure you're acknowledging First Nations, Métis, Inuit. And again, without getting into a very, I saw one that was very, I mean, it was like 3/4 of a page. It was like they want to be so politically correct. They wanted to be so inclusive that it turned into a speech. And that's it's complicated, right? So, you know, so like you said, Canada-wide and regional, you need to get the wording to address that. Terry McDougall from Callian, great. Glad you're on the call. She says, as a company with many locations across Canada, the Australian, you know, welcome to country acknowledgement really resonates with me. How important is it to recognize specific lands and communities? Well, again, I think when you acknowledge, Terry, the land in which you're on, so Terry is in Ottawa, you know, you're acknowledging the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. You know, there's the Ottawa-based one, right? So you are acknowledging, you know, the unceded territory. And I think that's what's important here. As you saw in the Australian one, it's recognizing elders past, present, and future. I always like that. I think that's something I'm going to start incorporating into my land acknowledgements. So I think we look. Some of you, thank you very much, folks, for the Q&A. These are great. And yeah, Rosie, what if there are overlapping territories? And there are. So be inclusive. None of us are the political folks that are going to arbitrate that dispute over territories. So be inclusive. You know, so I'll say this, be inclusive, include all the overlapping territories, and there are, you know, Dakota, the Bloods, there are these overlapping territories. And if someone, you know, this does not happen very often, but, you know, what if it does? What if someone challenges you and says, no, you know, it's wrong? I think the comeback I would have is to say, well, then can you please help us with the wording and put the onus back on the community partners to come up with the wording for the land acknowledgement. So take it and shift it so that it becomes a communal issue and figure it out. But like I said, I think if you're inclusive and you name different territories, you know, people are going to be satisfied with that. So folks, I guess as we now work with you, we hope to see more land acknowledgements happening. For those of you that are already doing it, perhaps you'll be able to expand it. And again, what we wanted to do is create this sense of, I think, enthusiasm, confidence, and let's all work together to make Canada, even more inclusive by incorporating things like land acknowledgements into our daily practices. So thanks very, very much for joining us, joining Craig and I, and we look forward to our next webinar. We've actually scheduled the next 14 webinars right through to 2022. So you can see the schedule of webinar topics and knowledge. This whole area of knowledge leadership is so important, folks. Knowledge capital is making a difference in inclusion. And so we've really structured and brought this forward so that you can look ahead in your own planning, and you might identify teams within your company to bring into your own thought leadership and knowledge capital training. So do take a look at our website to see the list of webinar knowledge series. And if any of you have any ideas on topics you would like to see, send them in to us, and we'd be pleased to see if we could incorporate them. Take care, everybody. Tapuin and ask them.